January 17, 1942. A remote Imperial Japanese Navy air station on the windswept coast of Formosa. The morning sky stretched pale and cloudless over the East China Sea, and the air tasted of salt and aviation fuel. Commander Minoru Genda stood on the tarmac beside a row of Mitsubishi G4M bombers, their engines still warm from the previous night's patrol. In his gloved hand, he held a decoded intelligence report, thin paper marked with urgent characters, and as he read it for the third time, his expression remained unchanged, but his mind had begun to recalculate everything he thought he knew about the war. ***. The report was brief. American bombers had been detected over the Central Pacific, operating at ranges previously considered impossible. They had flown more than 2,000 miles without landing, without returning to any known airfield, without the restrictions that governed every aerial operation the Japanese had ever planned. Genda folded the paper slowly and looked toward the horizon. He had designed the Pearl Harbor attack. He had calculated fuel loads down to the kilogram. He understood range as a law of physics, as immutable as gravity. And yet, somewhere out there, American pilots were breaking that law. For 2 decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its air doctrine on a single assumption: that aircraft range was finite, predictable, and constrained by the weight of fuel a plane could carry. Japanese planners had mastered this equation. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters could fly farther than any carrier-based fighter in the world, a feat achieved through fanatical weight reduction, stripping away armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, even pilot comfort. Their bombers stretched operational limits by cutting payloads, by accepting razor-thin margins, by demanding perfection from every pilot and mechanic. Range was purchased with sacrifice. Range was a negotiation with physics, but the Americans were not negotiating. They were simply flying. In the early months of 1942, Japanese intelligence began receiving fragmentary reports of American bomber activity that defied conventional analysis. B-17 Flying Fortresses and PBY Catalinas were operating deep into contested waters, appearing over targets far beyond their published range, then vanishing without trace of landing sites. At first, Japanese analysts dismissed these sightings as errors, misidentified aircraft, exaggerated distances, the fog of war. But the reports kept coming. Bombers over Wake Island. Patrol aircraft circling for 12 hours straight above the Coral Sea. Long-range reconnaissance missions that should have required forward bases that did not exist. Commander Genda was not a man who dismissed anomalies. He had spent years studying American industrial capacity, American logistics, American innovation. He knew that the United States possessed resources Japan could never match: steel production, oil reserves, manufacturing scale. But he had always believed that certain fundamental limits applied equally to all combatants. An airplane could only carry so much fuel. A mission could only extend so far from its base. These were not matters of wealth or willpower. These were matters of mathematics. And then, on April 18, 1942, the mathematics changed forever. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo was not the most destructive air attack of the war. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers dropped 30 tons of ordnance, less than a single night's work for a large bomber formation in Europe. Material damage was modest. Casualties numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. But the raid shattered something more important than buildings. It shattered the Japanese understanding of what was possible. The B-25s had launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, 650 nautical miles from Japan, a distance considered beyond the operational radius of carrier-based medium bombers. The Japanese had calculated correctly that American carriers could not approach closer without risking destruction. They had calculated correctly that land-based bombers lacked the range to strike from distant bases. They had built an entire defensive perimeter on these calculations. And yet, at midday on a spring Saturday, American bombs fell on the imperial capital. The raid's audacity was compounded by its aftermath. The bombers did not return to the carrier. They flew onward, across the breadth of Japan, across the East China Sea, crash landing or parachuting into China and Soviet territory, covering a total mission distance of over 2,000 miles. The pilots had known from the start that the mission was one-way. They had stripped their aircraft of unnecessary weight, filled every available space with fuel, and flown until their tanks ran dry. Japanese commanders stood on the smoking streets of Tokyo and confronted a terrible realization: American pilots were willing to die to reach them, and American planners were willing to expend aircraft like ammunition to achieve a strategic effect. Range was no longer a constraint. It was a weapon. But the Doolittle raid, for all its psychological impact, was still a desperate gamble, a one-time strike that sacrificed 16 bombers for a fleeting propaganda victory. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp in those early months was that the Americans were not merely stretching range through suicidal missions. They were systematically erasing it as a limiting factor. In the summer of 1942, fragments of intelligence began reaching Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo. Patrol reports from submarine crews, reconnaissance photographs from long-range flying boats, intercepted radio chatter from American bomber formations. And buried in these fragments were references to a technique that Japanese analysts initially believed was a translation error. The Americans were refueling their aircraft in flight. The concept was not entirely new. In the 1920s, several nations had experimented with aerial refueling as a stunt, a curiosity of aviation exhibitions. A small biplane would dangle a hose to another aircraft flying below, transferring gasoline in a fragile, dangerous ballet. It was a novelty, a demonstration that something was theoretically possible, but utterly impractical for military operations. The Japanese had studied these experiments and dismissed them. The procedure was too complex, too risky, too dependent on perfect weather and pilot skill. It required two aircraft to fly in close formation for extended periods, an invitation to disaster. And even if successful, it offered no meaningful tactical advantage. Better to build longer-range aircraft, to establish forward bases, to husband resources efficiently. The Americans had reached a different conclusion. In 1943, as the Pacific War entered its second year, the United States Army Air Forces began quietly integrating air refueling into operational doctrine. Modified B-17 and B-24 bombers were equipped as tankers, carrying thousands of gallons of transferable fuel in bomb bay tanks. Receiver aircraft were fitted with receptacles and trained in the delicate art of formation flying at refueling speeds. Procedures were standardized. Crews drilled until the dangerous became routine. And then, without announcement or fanfare, American bombers began appearing in places they had no right to be. A Japanese garrison on Truk Atoll, fortified and confident in its remoteness, was struck by B-24 Liberators that had flown from bases over 1,000 miles away, refueled mid-flight, delivered their payloads, refueled again, and returned home. Reconnaissance aircraft loitered for 16 hours over Japanese-held waters, watching convoy movements, radioing coordinates, sustained by aerial tankers that appeared like clockwork every 4 hours. Fighter escorts accompanied bomber formations deep into enemy territory, distances that would have left them swimming in the ocean, but they touched wings with tanker aircraft and drank fuel at altitude and pressed onward. For Japanese commanders, the implications were apocalyptic. Every defensive calculation had been premised on range. Naval bases were positioned beyond the reach of enemy bombers. Convoys were routed along paths that kept them outside hostile air patrol zones. Aircraft carriers operated with confidence that enemy land-based planes could not pursue them past a certain radius. But if American aircraft could refuel in flight, then there was no safe distance. There was no sanctuary. There was only the question of whether the Americans chose to strike. In the cramped briefing rooms of Combined Fleet Headquarters, staff officers began working through the mathematics of aerial refueling and found themselves confronting a logistical nightmare. The technique did not merely extend range, it multiplied options exponentially. A bomber with a 1,500-mile radius could, with a single refueling, operate across 3,000 miles. With 2 refuelings, it could cross the Pacific. With enough tanker support, it could fly indefinitely, circling like a vulture, waiting. But more disturbing than the mathematics was the philosophy behind it. Aerial refueling was not elegant. It was not efficient in the way Japanese doctrine prized efficiency. It required enormous supporting infrastructure, tanker aircraft, trained crews, secure airbases for both tankers and receivers, vast stockpiles of aviation fuel. It was profligate, wasteful, an approach that only made sense if resources were effectively infinite. And for the United States, they were. Japan had entered the war betting that American wealth was a weakness, that a soft, luxury-addicted nation would lack the will to endure sacrifice. But as the war ground on, Japanese commanders began to understand that American abundance was not a weakness. It was a doctrine. The United States did not ask, "Can we afford this?" They asked, "Will this work?" And if the answer was yes, they did it regardless of cost. Aerial refueling embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was not born of necessity. Japan refueled by necessity, by capturing enemy fuel stocks, by rationing down to the last liter, by sending pilots into battle with barely enough fuel to return. Americans refueled in midair because they could, because they had so much fuel that they could afford to burn thousands of gallons simply extending the range of a single mission, because the strategic advantage of ubiquity was worth any price. In late 1943, a Japanese flying boat on patrol near the Marshall Islands photographed an American aerial refueling operation purely by chance. The images were rushed to Tokyo, analyzed by aviation experts, and distributed among senior commanders. The photographs showed two B-24 Liberators flying in close formation, connected by a thin umbilical hose, fuel flowing between them at 200 miles per hour. The receiving bomber's propellers glinted in the sun. The tanker aircraft flew steady and straight, its crew trusting physics and training to keep tons of metal and gasoline from colliding. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, studied the photographs in silence. He had visited the United States before the war, had walked through American factories, had seen the assembly lines that produced automobiles by the millions. He had warned his superiors that Japan could not win a long war against such an economy. But even he had underestimated the creativity with which Americans would deploy their abundance. They were not merely outbuilding Japan, they were out-imagining Japan, finding solutions to problems Japan had not realized could be solved. Yamamoto asked his staff to calculate what it would take for Japan to implement aerial refueling on an operational scale. The answer was numbing. Japan lacked the surplus aircraft to dedicate as tankers. Japan lacked the surplus fuel to expend on training and operations. Japan lacked the surplus pilots to form refueling crews. Japan lacked the surplus industrial capacity to manufacture the specialized equipment. Japan lacked the surplus everything. The technique was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. The Americans had not invented something new. They had simply spent their way past constraints that Japan could not afford to ignore. And so, Japanese commanders watched as American air power became untethered from geography. They watched as bomber formations struck targets once considered invulnerable. They watched as patrol aircraft lingered over convoy routes, calling in submarine wolf packs that decimated supply lines. They watched as fighters escorted heavy bombers all the way to Tokyo and back, their presence made possible only by tanker aircraft that never entered combat but made combat everywhere possible. The psychological effect was corrosive. Japanese pilots began each mission knowing that American aircraft might appear anywhere, anytime, sustained by an invisible network of support that stretched across the Pacific. There was no rear area. There was no respite. The ocean that had once protected Japan now seemed traversable, as if the Americans had built a highway across the waves and could simply drive their bombers to Tokyo whenever they wished. In contrast, Japanese air operations became increasingly desperate. Pilots flew knowing that fuel was measured to the minute, that mechanical failure meant death, that there was no margin for error. Kamikaze tactics emerged partly from this calculus. If fuel was scarce and pilots were expendable, then one-way missions became strategically rational. Better to crash into an enemy ship than to crash into the sea for lack of fuel. Better to die with purpose than to ditch your aircraft 50 miles from home because planners had shaved your fuel load to the minimum. The Americans, meanwhile, flew with what seemed like reckless abandon. They loitered. They took detours. They circled damaged aircraft until rescue arrived. They expended fuel on displays of dominance, flying low over Japanese positions, waggling wings, daring anti-aircraft gunners to waste ammunition. They could afford to. Somewhere behind them, invisible and inexhaustible, a tanker was waiting. By 1944, aerial refueling had become so routine in American operations that Japanese intelligence stopped remarking on it. It was simply assumed that any American aircraft could appear anywhere, that range was no longer a factor in defensive planning. The focus shifted to trying to shoot down the tankers, to disrupt the refueling operations themselves. But the tankers flew far behind friendly lines, protected by layers of fighter cover, unreachable. Japanese engineers made one last attempt to respond in kind. In late 1944, a small experimental program was launched to develop indigenous aerial refueling capability. A handful of bombers were modified. Trials were conducted over calm seas with hand-picked crews. The results were technically successful, fuel was transferred, aircraft landed safely. But the program was quietly shelved. There was no fuel to spare for operational refueling. There were no surplus aircraft to serve as tankers. There was no time to train crews. The Americans had not merely invented a technique. They had created an entire ecosystem, logistical, industrial, doctrinal, that made the technique sustainable. Japan could replicate the mechanics but not the system. In the final year of the war, as American B-29 superfortresses firebombed Japanese cities night after night, aerial refueling played a quieter but crucial role. Escort fighters accompanied the bombers on their long flights from the Marianas to Japan, sustained by tankers stationed over Iwo Jima. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed damage, loitered for hours, returned with intelligence that guided the next raid. Search and rescue planes patrolled the routes, refueled at sea, plucked down airmen from the water. The entire air campaign was lubricated by fuel flowing through hoses in mid-flight, an invisible supply line that turned the Pacific Ocean into a highway. Japanese defenders could only watch and endure. They shot down bombers when they could, but the bombers kept coming. They shot down fighters, but more fighters appeared. They understood, finally, that they were not fighting an enemy with better pilots or better planes. They were fighting an enemy who had abolished the concept of distance, who had made the sky into an infinite battlefield, who could sustain operations at a scale and duration that Japan could not imagine, let alone match. After the war, during the occupation, American officers sat across tables from their former enemies and shared operational details that had been closely guarded secrets. Japanese aviation officers listened to descriptions of aerial refueling procedures, of tanker orbits and rendezvous protocols, of fuel flow rates and hose couplings. They listened, and they asked the question that had haunted them since 1942: why had they never considered it? The American officers struggled to answer. Because you could, they said. Because the capability existed, so you used it. Because once you started thinking of fuel as something that could be delivered anywhere, everything changed. Because American doctrine had always been about extending reach, about ensuring that no place on Earth was safe from American power, and aerial refueling was simply the logical conclusion of that philosophy. But the deeper answer, the one that went unspoken, was about abundance. Japan had fought a war of scarcity, hoarding every resource, optimizing every system, trying to do more with less. America had fought a war of plenty, spending freely, building redundancy, accepting waste as the price of overwhelming force. Aerial refueling was a perfect symbol of this divide. It was inefficient, extravagant, and absolutely unstoppable. But the deeper answer, the one that went unspoken, was about abundance. Japan had fought a war of scarcity, hoarding every resource, optimizing every system, trying to do more with less. America had fought a war of plenty, spending freely, building redundancy, accepting waste as the price of overwhelming force. Aerial refueling was a perfect symbol of this divide. It was inefficient, extravagant, and absolutely unstoppable. In the end, the B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not require aerial refueling. They flew from Tinian, close enough to reach Japan on internal fuel alone. But the capability was there, had the missions required it. Tankers were on standby. Procedures were in place. The bombs could have been delivered from anywhere in the Pacific, sustained by an endless chain of fuel, because the Americans had decided that distance would not constrain them. Commander Genda survived the war. In the decades that followed, he became an architect of Japan's post-war self-defense forces, helping to rebuild Japanese air power under American guidance. He studied American air doctrine, adopted American tactics, and came to understand the philosophy that had defeated him. It was not just about technology or resources. It was about imagination. The Americans had imagined a world where aircraft were not chained to bases, where fuel was not a cage, where the horizon was not a limit. And then they had built that world. There is a photograph from 1947, taken at an airfield in occupied Japan. It shows an American KB-29 tanker refueling a Japanese crewed C-54 transport as part of a training exercise. The Japanese crew is learning American techniques, preparing for a future where Japan would operate within the American-led security architecture. In the photograph, you can see the hose stretched between aircraft, fuel flowing, the two planes locked in formation. It is a mundane image, a routine operation. But for the Japanese crew, it must have carried a weight of memory. This simple act, receiving fuel in midair, represented everything they had lost. Sovereignty. Self-sufficiency. The ability to define their own operational limits. The Americans had not merely defeated Japan with superior firepower. They had redefined what was possible, and in doing so, had made Japanese doctrine obsolete before the first shot was fired. Aerial refueling was not the reason Japan lost the war. But it was a perfect metaphor for why Japan could never have won. Because the Americans did not accept limits. They engineered around them, spent past them, innovated through them. And in a war of attrition, the side that refuses to be constrained by reality will always defeat the side bound by it. 70 years later, aerial refueling is so routine that it rarely draws notice. Modern tanker aircraft refuel fighters over contested airspace, bombers mid-mission, reconnaissance planes on multi-day patrols. The technique Commander Genda once considered impossible is now the backbone of global air power projection. American aircraft can reach anywhere on Earth, not because they have the longest range, but because they never need to land. The sky has become an infinite logistics network, a web of invisible supply lines that make distance irrelevant. And at the heart of this capability is the same philosophy that powered every aerial refueling operation in World War II, that abundance is a strategy, that limits exist to be overcome, that the nation willing to spend its wealth on solutions rather than husbanding it against scarcity will write the rules of the world. Japan learned this lesson the hardest way possible. They learned it in the skies over Tokyo, watching bombers that should not have been there. They learned it in convoy ambushes by patrol planes that should have run out of fuel. They learned it in the long, grinding realization that they were fighting an enemy who had abolished the concept of too far. On that January morning in 1942, when Commander Genda first read the intelligence report about impossibly long-range American bombers, he understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. He did not yet know about aerial refueling, did not yet grasp the mechanism, but he understood the implication. The Americans were operating under different rules. They were playing a different game. And Japan, for all its courage and skill and determination, had brought a calculator to a war against a nation that had decided mathematics were optional. The Americans had not asked how far their aircraft could fly. They had asked how far they needed to fly, and then they had built the capability to match the requirement. Range became whatever they decided it should be. The horizon became a suggestion. This is the lesson written in contrails across the Pacific sky, in every hose stretched between tanker and receiver, in every bomber that flew 2,000 miles and returned. Freedom, as the Americans understood it, was not merely political. It was operational. It was the freedom from constraint, from scarcity, from the tyranny of distance. It was the freedom to imagine that limits were problems to be solved, and then to solve them with steel and fuel and the unshakable belief that anything possible was worth doing. The Japanese never considered aerial refueling because they could not afford to. The Americans made it routine because they could. And in that difference, in that vast gulf between necessity and capability, the war's outcome was written long before the fighting ended. Not because of any single battle, but because of a fundamental asymmetry in how the two nations understood the word. Impossible. For Japan, it meant a boundary. For America, it meant a challenge. And when those philosophies collided over the Pacific, only one could survive. The sky remembers everything.